In thinking about popular culture, one of the ways to think about it is to look at the history of popular culture, where it came from, how it began, and to whom it was addressed. And we were talking about Veronica Mars and the teen television series. I wanted you to think more about, in fact, the history of the teenager and how the teenager came to be an audience that was specifically addressed by popular culture on television, and indeed in buying records and in movies from the 1950s onwards. And there is indeed quite a history of the invention of the teenager, which is often seen as a phenomenon that begins to emerge in the 1940s and 50s after the end of the Second World War, which ended in 1945, and a more settled and more affluent society began to appear, where young people began to have more consumer spending and could buy the kinds of things that they wanted to entertain themselves, which included records, which included going to the movies. And television began to advertise to teenagers and therefore started to make programs for teenagers, so that we get teen television emerging in the 1950s and 60s as the teenager themselves begins to emerge as a cultural phenomenon. So that's a fairly recent historical dimension to thinking about popular culture. But we can, in fact, go much, much further back to thinking about popular culture. And in that regard, I want to go back, way back, to a period which is really before the written book itself. And that is when stories are told by poets who perform them at various kinds of courts, and we're talking around the 5th, 6th, 7th century in the European part of the world, and I'm obviously not talking about the Asian context, where of course there were other forms of popular culture. But there was a long poem written called Beowulf, and that poem, which was emerged, finally when they got it written down, it was about the 10th or 11th century, but that poem, which had been circulating for some time, has remained so popular that I thought I might show you one of the most recent manifestations of that poem in a short trailer for a movie which some of you may have seen.
Are you the one they call Beowulf? Such a strong man you are. A man like you could own the greatest tale ever sung. Beowulf, stay with me. Give me a son, and I shall make you the greatest king that ever lived. This, I swear. You will forever be king. Forever strong. Mighty. Beyond imagination.
What are you? She's not my curse. Not anymore.
Okay, so there's the details. We have a poem written in AD 700 or thereabouts. It's an epic poem of 3,182 lines. It's written in Anglo-Saxon, which when I went to university as an English student, I had to learn. And indeed, I translated the whole of this poem when I was at university and loved it. And it's interesting to speculate, you know, here is a 20th century person reading a poem that was written way, way, way back when, and responding to it and loving it. And of course it was about the language, the use of words, even in translation. And there are many translated versions of it. But the question to ask is, why has that particular piece of popular culture had such power, such longevity, and is still a resource that keeps getting remade in different forms? Well, you've got a hero called Beowulf, and you've got some fantastic baddies. You've got a monster called Grendel. His mother, Grendel's mother, who in the film, that most recent version that you saw, is played by Angelina Jolie, who doesn't look anything like the monster as she's described in the poem. But hey, you know, when popular culture remakes things, it remakes them, and if it's Angelina Jolie, I'm just happy people are watching Beowulf. And in the final chapter, there is also a dragon. So what you actually have is this hero, Beowulf, meeting a whole series of tests, having to deal with them, having to battle against them and overcome. And if we think, well, you know, dragons and monsters, they're not very real today, look at the popularity of a series like Lord of the Rings, which was written in the 1930s and the 1940s by J.R.R. Tolkien. In fact, he started writing The Hobbit, I think, in the 1930s, and in fact, Lord of the Rings was written during the 1950s. There is J.R. Tolkien, who was himself a scholar of Old English, would know Beowulf very well, taking that idea of a mythical fantasy kingdom and making it into a book which has this extraordinary longevity, gets made into these films to which people respond. Not just because these are magical places, but because they recognize that what you're seeing is the power of the human spirit. And they're great stories about people facing trials, dealing with problems, revenge, desire, conflict, and overcoming in one way or another. That's, I suppose, how I want to think about popular culture and why it is so powerful and why we invest so much in it, why it speaks to us. I would argue that popular culture is most successful when it very precisely addresses our hopes, our fears, our anxieties, our obsessions, our concerns, our desires and our needs. It speaks to us in some way that we recognize, whether we're dealing with the monster from the Black Deep or Grendel or Sauron or hobbits or whatever. They speak to us in some way because they connect with the things that we're concerned about and with moral issues, with the kinds of things that we deal with in everyday life, even though the setting itself is so fanciful or so very, very different. So popular culture is popular because it speaks to us in one way or another. And to take it a little bit further, now here's an idea for a depth study. What about those monsters? What about why Grendel is still with us? Here's another kind of monster who has had a very, very long life and is still with us, the vampire. Some of you may have read a little bit about the origins of where the myth of the vampire actually starts and whether in fact vampires are real, but there was indeed a rather nasty character called Vlad the Impaler, who his particular method of killing people included spiking them, putting a stake through them, which emerged through their mouth and allowing them to die in particularly horrible ways. And somehow this guy, Vlad Dracul, became associated with this notion of vampirism, this idea that some sort of monster would appear and would suck the blood out of you and reduce you to a walking shade, condemned to live forever on the earth. Now, that might not sound very sensible, but whatever that anxiety was about being taken over, about your losing control, about being consumed in some way, has in fact had a very long life. Dracula as a book appears in the 1880s when Bram Stoker takes together all the myths of vampirism and writes this extraordinary book, which is a little bit tricky to read if you're used to kind of 20th century prose, but it's still a wonderful book to read. It becomes a bestseller. Bram Stoker becomes famous, and indeed the very first film of Dracula appears in a silent version in the 1920s. And Dracula has, in a sense, never gone away since. I think we'll talk about Dracula a bit more next week, but you might want to think about him in the meanwhile.